Nehemiah and planning. That's what we are looking at this morning. What lessons are there for you and me to learn? So let's just read the short passage. It's Nehemiah chapter 2 from verse 11 to 20. I went to Jerusalem and after staying, this is of course Nehemiah speaking, I went to Jerusalem and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem which had been broken down and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally I turned back and re-entered the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." So, what are we going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at some key principles. And I want to say to you that there are two that I suggest are in this passage. Number one, God is sovereign. God is in control. But we also have got responsibility. And that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to start talking about our responsibility. And we read together what Nehemiah did initially. It's great, recording these meetings, because I can, even though I wasn't here, I know exactly what Jasper said, and it was exceedingly helpful. And I think it is helpful if we can move on from what has been built before. So let's think about Nehemiah's initial reactions. First of all, God had told him where to go. God had told him Jerusalem is the place. And so he went there. That's important for you and me. We need to be where God wants us to be, doing what God wants us to do. Now, what did he do next? He set out during the night with a few others. So, in his planning process, he involved a few people. He didn't involve everybody, but we will see, of course, as we go through the passage, that what he does, he has a plan to rebuild the walls that he wants everyone to buy into, but the process that he goes through is a lesson for you and me. First of all, what he wanted to do was to discover exactly how big the need was. Now, he recognized that it was his personal burden. Look what he says. I had not told anyone what God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. What did he know? Well, we know from chapter 1 what he knew. Chapter 1, he knew the walls were broken down. Number 2, he knew the gates were burned with fire. But he didn't actually know exactly what that meant. So we read about how he discovered how big the problem was, and how he clearly recognized that if those who came with him knew how big the problem actually was, they probably would have been exceedingly discouraged. So what he does is he sets out to find out what's going on. This was his personal responsibility. And notice, it was a personal responsibility based in the relationship that he actually had with God. And we saw a great deal about that in chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2. What God was really mattered to Nehemiah. And you know, that's important that you and I really grip hold of. What God is there for all of us. But actually, it's only what we make use of. It's only our appreciation and our actions that actually are going to be effective for him. You know, one of the key lessons of the Old Testament is that there are lots of people that we come into contact with who had a knowledge of God, but it didn't affect their lives. In the New Testament, we've got exactly the same. You know, the Apostle Paul tells us that before his Damascus Road experience, he really believed that he was a true God follower. What God was mattered to him, but it was his appreciation of it, not the reality. Now, Nehemiah makes it very clear that we have to have a real knowledge of the presence of God. So what's the first thing Nehemiah does? Well, he goes out and he evaluates the situation. Now, there's somebody I know quite well. He's a Swiss Christian, and he teaches leadership studies. And he actually bases it on the book of Nehemiah. And he is a man of professorial ability. He's in one of the universities in Switzerland teaching leadership. And he bases his course on the book of Nehemiah. And he's very practical with the course, because he goes out to other countries and trains leaders who then set up businesses and so on. And I know this is one of the passages he uses, because I've actually heard Mario speak on this, how important it is to evaluate the problem. And look, here is the problem. And what does he do to begin with? Well, he confirms the information that he had from Hanani and the others, those who spoke to him in chapter 1. He goes out and he says, yes, I can rely on what they have told me. But he wanted to understand exactly what that meant. You know, he's now taking theoretical knowledge, which Hanani had given him in chapter 1, and he's actually making his way around the city and finding out what does it mean. Well, it actually meant he couldn't get it. I know in this picture he's on a horse, but actually scripture doesn't put him on a horse, does it? He's on a donkey. And, he couldn't even get his donkey through the fountain gate and the king's pool. So he goes on, researching the depth of the problem. Having done that, we then see what his strategy was. So, when we're seeking to do things for God, we have to assess the situation. Then what we need to do is set out on a planning process. And I've already mentioned that part of his strategy was to get to understand the problem before he puts it out to others. It's actually very interesting, isn't it? When you look at the list of people who he didn't tell. He didn't tell the Jews, the priests, or nobles, or officials, or any others. They were the ones who were going to do the work, but he doesn't tell them at this point. Until he's done the evaluation and the preparation, he's not telling them what is actually going to take place. What he does is confirm and understand the problem before taking action. And that, is so important, that when we're going to do things, you see, what had happened, and this I think is an important lesson. What had happened was Nehemiah had a burden to do something for God. That's quite clear. He knew that in doing something for God, he couldn't do it alone. He knew that he had to take others with him. And so he has a strategy for doing that. Now, the truth of the matter is, we're going to be talking a little bit later about different burdens that people have got. It's a great burden that we've got for this website at the moment. Some of us aren't capable of doing anything for it, but there are others who are very capable. And what is important is those who are very capable hand on to others. And this is what happens here with Nehemiah. Nehemiah had enormous skills of leadership. And so he makes sure that he knows what he can pass on to others. So, what does he do? Well, he presents the issues to the officials. It's very interesting to notice what he says. He says, "You see the trouble we are in." And he spells it out. Jerusalem lies in ruins and the gates have been burnt with fire. So, yes, says Nehemiah, it's my problem, but actually it's your problem as well. And he knows exactly what he is talking about. And then he goes on and he says to them, these are the issues, and we have got a responsibility. And it is that we recognize them. And having recognized them, we realize their impact. Notice the impact. They are causing the people of God to be a disgrace. Yeah, sometimes we as the people of God are a disgrace, aren't we? When we're not doing what God wants us to do. And I guess Nehemiah knew that in his heart right from the beginning. These people had messed up. These people had caused huge problems. Now, as I said when we were looking at chapter 1, he wasn't in Jerusalem when all the problems were there. He was actually representing the people of God in the court of the emperor. But Nehemiah wasn't someone who said, these are your problems, you've made difficulties. Nehemiah was somebody who was constantly seeking to say to the people of God, brothers and sisters, we're in this together. And you know, that's so important, that whatever is done for God, we are in it together. But it's also good that, like Nehemiah, we've got a solution. And have you noticed his solution? Let us rebuild. We will no longer be in disgrace. So what he's seeking to do is to motivate all the people of God to do something effective. Now, he's clearly laying out a pretty big agenda, isn't he? Rebuilding the walls of the city of Jerusalem. We are going to see next week that some of the builders weren't actually the kind of people you would expect to build. You might like to read chapter 3 before next week and see if what I'm saying is right. You know, some of the people who did the building were actually the last kind of people you would have expected. Oh, and the issue is, what about those who don't get their hands dirty? But those are questions for next week. So, what does Nehemiah do? He tells all of the people who are there involved in the building about the gracious hand of my God on me. Now, Jasper dealt last week with how it must have been for Nehemiah in the presence of the emperor. An emperor who was well known for taking people who came to see him and impaling them immediately afterwards. That's what happened to Haman, isn't it? You know? It was an immediate sentence of death. That was the situation Nehemiah was in, being in a place where he could have been put to death immediately. But he wasn't. And again, as Jasper told us last week, not only did he ask the king could he go back to Jerusalem, no, he asked for letters of protection as they travelled, and he also asked for materials. That's how gracious God was. God made sure that this man who went in to the presence of the emperor got all the answers he was looking for. So his experience of what God had done in the past, he now says, look, if I can go into the presence of the emperor and all this can happen, actually rebuilding the wall is not such a difficult task. Because of my experience with God in the past, I can say to you, there is a way forward. And you know, it's good when we can encourage each other in doing the work of God. And we see, don't we, so beautifully. We see so beautifully what happens next. They reply, let us start the rebuilding. Do you know what I find really beautiful? They all took ownership of this. They didn't say, okay, Nehemiah, you tell us what to do, we'll do it. No, of course that was going to happen. But what they said is, let us do the work. And look at the amazing commentary on this work. They began this good work. They weren't just talkers, they were doers. But of course, I was going to say Jasper's friend Sanballat appeared, because Jasper told us a fair bit about him last week, didn't he? This fella Sanballat appears. And you know, we have to face that whatever we're doing for God is likely to be opposed. So, how do we deal with hostility? Well, we start off by recognizing what it is. You know, I was going to say it was appropriate to the situation. Well, I guess as far as Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem were concerned, they were actually saying, you know, how can we deal with these people? Well, actually, they're just a handful of Jews who are seeking to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Let's mock them. Let's ridicule them. Let's go a stage further. Let's accuse them. Now, it's interesting, you know, some people can take mocking and ridicule. But actually, when somebody actually makes a totally false allegation against us, which could cause massive problems, we get very worried. So we have to face that when we are involved in serving God, there are likely to be difficulties. But there is a solution. When these people were attacking Nehemiah, notice what he says. The God of heaven will give us success. Great thing about Nehemiah was he didn't just say we can trust God. He proved we can trust God. And he showed his confidence in God. That's important. We need to be confident in God. It was interesting, Dave was reminding us in the planning meeting for the Holiday Bible Club, something that's worried us over the years. What are we going to do if too many people arrived? Dave reminded us, God has never sent us more children than we can cope with. And we have to have confidence in God, you know, when we are involved in doing things for him. And you know, it's important. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. There was a personal commitment to do the work of God. But at the same time, it was a work that he was doing for God with no compromise. He doesn't say to Sanballat, Tobiah and Geshem, okay boys, we'll give you a little bit to do. No, they had no part with it. It was a work that was done with absolutely no compromise. But as I said at the beginning, we do actually see that God is sovereign in all this situation. I am sure Nehemiah had no idea at all that what he was doing was fulfilling a prophecy in the Old Testament. A prophecy that actually you and I benefit from today. Look at it. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel has asked God, when is Israel going back into the promised land? And look at God's answer. God doesn't say exactly when, but he tells him what is going to happen. Daniel 9 verse 25. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. 69 sets of sevens. What God actually told Daniel was God has got a clock. Well, actually, God's got a calendar. And what is going to start that calendar is for a decree to go out that says, restore and rebuild Jerusalem. And of course, We've just been reading all about that. And what we have observed is how amazing our God actually is. So, a few points about the scriptural development that we've got here when it comes to planning. It all started with personal conviction. Then there was a personal commitment. Then there was prayer. Then there was effective planning. And part of the effective planning was, how do we enable others? Nehemiah wasn't going to do it all on his own. He needed others involved. They had to face problems. And they had to be mindful of God.